welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Makpool with you at BTB World. In today's show, we will be talking about two very important stories. Of course, the first is with reference to what is going on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly session, and of course part of the high-level debate as well, in which there are numerous important issues that are very close and relevant to what is going on in Pakistan at the moment that we're going to be discussing, especially with regards to climate change and the impact of the devastating floods within our country. There have been a number of meetings that the Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has attended on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly session, and he will be addressing the high-level debate on Friday. There is, of course, what the US President Joe Biden has also spoken about, which the Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif thanked him for in a tweet today regarding, of course, the impact of climate change that is very real and current in Pakistan, and that it needs our help. He has also announced a $2.9 billion fund for humanitarian food security for the entire world this year. And of course, there is the impact that that's going to have on the kind of needs that Pakistan is also facing along with many other countries. This is, of course, an important discussion, and we will be taking a look at the kind of issues and avenues that the UN General Assembly session provides for climate change issues in Pakistan, and what the meetings on the sidelines of this General Assembly session means for Pakistan, especially with regards to the ongoing crisis on ground and the kind of windows for financing opportunities that we're looking forward to. That has also been reiterated by the Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari and spoken about in terms of debt restructuring modalities by financial institutions such as the IMF, and obviously of foreign donors as well, to be able to look at countries like Pakistan already suffering from an economic crisis that was there even before these floods occurred. And now, of course, after that, the damage is huge. There is, of course, also concern with regards to the appeal and the amount that has been put forward before, and how that does not take into account the massive scale of loss and damage that Pakistan is facing and will continue to face in the coming days and months. In our second segment, we will be closely looking at the situation on ground with regards to the floods, especially in the aftermath of which we have seen an outbreak of health issues and diseases that have spread in various regions of the country. Of course, these floods have impacted more than 33 million people. That is 1 out of 7 Pakistanis that have been impacted. And now there are numerous needs of women and children, of the elderly, of the people who are sick, that has, of course, been increasing for quite some time since the outbreak of waterborne diseases and also others such as dengue and malaria. And these issues continue to rise in light of the food security crisis, the economic instability within Pakistan, and the lack of resources that we're currently facing in terms of our humanitarian aid and support that is needed. There is, of course, the rehabilitation that is now bound to come also after the water recedes, and what is going to be done with regards to the loss and damage that has occurred, and how we move forward from there towards more resilient climate change infrastructure. So that is going to be our second segment of the show today. For this and more, as always, I've been joined in the studios by senior analyst Farooq Patafi, and we've also been joined online for our first segment with regards to the UN General Assembly session and its relevance in Pakistan at the moment by Dr. Salim Ali, who's a distinguished professor and chair of geography at the University of Delaware. He's also a member of UN International Resource Panel and author of Earthly Order: How Natural Laws Define Human Life. Thank you very much, Dr. Salim, for joining us in the debate. We've also been joined by Mr. Michael Kugelman, Deputy Director of the Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. Thank you very much, Michael, for being with us on the show today. We had hoped that you would be here in person at some point, but unfortunately we missed you this trip around, but hopefully next time. Let us start with Dr. Salim and take a look at what has been going on in terms of course, the UN General Assembly session and its relevance in terms of the meeting itself, and then, of course, the kind of bilateral engagements that have existed overall. Firstly, Dr. Salim, your take on the impact that this General Assembly session as a platform has on issues that are so relevant and global in scale, such as climate change, because, of course, this is very important and relevant to Pakistan. There are, of course, other platforms that are more specifically looking after these issues, but at the moment, what the UN Secretary General was pointing out is global collective action to issues such as climate change, conflicts, and food security issues, that we need that sort of collective response from the world as well. But unfortunately, it seems because of the way that the UN works in the UN General Assembly not being a binding platform, we see that perhaps the debate that go on such platforms do not result into tangible action. Do you have hope in terms of any way forward in terms of countries like Pakistan so severely impacted by issues such as climate change that we will be even closer towards any sort of collective action on any global issue at the moment?
Yes, thank you, Sana. I think it's quite encouraging that climate change has figured so prominently in the General Assembly conversations, given that we are going through such a serious conflict in Ukraine, which could have eclipsed conversations on climate change completely. So, on that note, it's encouraging that climate change has risen to high politics when we have such a serious war and peace dynamic also going on between a nuclear armed permanent member of the Security Council, I might add, and another country which has been historically well supported in terms of development assistance. So, that being said, uh, the UN process for decision making is through consensus in many cases, and in other cases through voting mechanisms and ratification of international agreements and so on. So, when it comes to issues like debt relief, we could have consensus based decisions with some of the major donors, and there could be an opportunity for international monetary institutions to engage on debt relief for countries which are impacted by climate change. That is a major development because debt relief is something that would impact Pakistan tremendously. So, if climate change impacts get linked to debt relief, and the argument is made that much of the development of other countries in the West, particularly, has happened because of their profligate emissions and so on, then countries which are suffering deserve debt relief. So, those are the areas where I see some
Right, but Dr.
encouragement.
Salim, is that really happening at the moment? Of course, that is the hope that loss and damage financing discussions are going to be part of the climate change discourse. But is that happening at the moment, and do you see that happening in the near future?
And Dr. Saab, since you have written a book as well called Earthly Order: How Natural Laws Define Human Life, and since UN is also debating the need to fight climate change, so far what we have seen is the talk of mitigation. Do you think that there is any plan, international plan, for resilience as well, capacity building in that context?
Yes. Yes, certainly, Farooq Saab. I think overall there is now a shift globally from mitigation to adaptation. 90% of climate financing historically has gone to mitigation. But now that it's becoming increasingly clear that we will not be able to meet many of those targets and the impacts of climate change are palpable, adaptation is gaining traction. And with reference to my book, one of the arguments I make is that we do not have good ecological literacy where people can have a conversation that links natural constraints, natural order to political order. And so I think that's the conversation that is now beginning to happen with politicians at the highest level in terms of these kinds of adaptive strategies. The Green Climate Fund was established in COP15 in Copenhagen. Now we are going at COP27, so you can imagine the time that's passed. And that process of the Green Climate Fund finally getting the money to go into adaptive strategies is heartening. So, for example, Pakistan has a Green Climate Fund project, which is focused on using existing depressions in the terrain to channel water from flood affected areas into those depressions. It's called Pakistan Recharge. And that could be enormously beneficial in the future when we have these extreme weather events with the western shift of the monsoon, and that would not even require building new dams. Now, that's a project that's funded by the Green Climate Fund through the UN mechanism. So, that's the kind of progress which I do see as heartening.
Right. Mr. Michael, considering, of course, these issues that are very relevant to Pakistan at the moment and the kind of difficulties that we see in terms of urgent action needed by international partners. The discussion at the UN General Assembly session and how it will pave way for discussion of the COP27, we of course would like it to focus more on the window of financing opportunities and the inclusion of loss and damage in the discussion as well. There is of course talk of debt restructuring modalities as well. Of course, we just were able to negotiate a bailout package with the IMF, considering our own economic instability and issues as well. We're also at a very precarious situation in terms of handling this crisis and handling economic stability at home. Do you think that this is something that can be looked at in a more urgent manner? And if or not, there actually exists a possibility for any sort of debt restructuring by the financial institutions?
Well, I hope so. It's hard to say at this point, but I think it is. As my friend Salim had said, it's very significant and notable that the issue of climate change and also, of course, the floods in Pakistan became or have become a key agenda point at the UNGA meetings. The fact that the Secretary General, in his comments yesterday, referred specifically to what Pakistan is going through and the links between these floods and climate change. That's significant. And the UNGA summit and the UN more broadly, the discussions that take place there, they contribute in a big way to norm shaping in international affairs. So, in other words, the fact that the UN is making a big deal out of climate change and focusing on how it relates to the floods in Pakistan, that suggests that there's good reason to think that many within the international community will recognize that it's important to drill down on these issues and perhaps getting into the types of issues that you had mentioned before. But then again, I think we need to be realistic in the sense that it's a difficult moment if we want to be talking about questions of debt restructuring, if we want to be talking about more broadly the issue of longer-term international assistance to Pakistan focused on climate adaptation or mitigation assistance. There's just, there are already multiple acute humanitarian crises in the world, of Ukraine, as we had heard, as well as Afghanistan and Yemen and so many others. Donor fatigue is very much present right now in
Right.
ways that it may not have been some years ago, including during the 2010 floods in Pakistan. And of course, the global economy has sustained a series of major shocks in recent months because of the pandemic, because of the war in Ukraine. That all creates a more difficult environment. So I think that in many ways the onus will be on Pakistan. How will Pakistan make the case? And I certainly hope it succeeds in this. How will Pakistan make the case to the international community that now is the moment to focus intently on issues like debt restructuring and related issues? I think the argument isn't that difficult to make, given how catastrophic these floods were and given how difficult a position it puts Pakistan, a country that does not contribute to global warming in a big way at all, and yet, of course, it pays one of the biggest prices because of its climate vulnerability. The case shouldn't be that hard to make, but I think ultimately it'll come down to Pakistan's government to make that argument.
Right, and it shouldn't be that difficult, but I want to understand, Farooq, we keep quoting this fact that Pakistan contributes much less to global carbon emissions than anybody else, and of course there are countries in the world that are impacting climate change issues much more and need to be more responsible. But how relevant is this piece of information to those countries themselves and the way that the international community is responding? They're currently not facing the issue.
Right, Sana, and that is a very good question because Pakistani media keeps on repeating these automatic negative thoughts. I've been hearing many people that the world is not going to listen to us, but they are mixed signals, right? This is an early stage. You realize that water hasn't actually left yet. But yesterday, something very interesting happened. The head of USAID, that is Samantha Power, actually went to Stephen Colbert's program, and she spoke about various important developments regarding UN and everything. She pointed out and she actually described her visit to Pakistan, and she actually characterized it as apocalyptic. And she particularly talked about the fact that while she was 200 miles inland, at that time she thought that she was actually flying over the ocean, right? Pakistan, for some reason, has become, the exhibit A of climate change.
Yeah.
That is true. So first thing that I take from this is the realization in the Western leaders, among the Western leaders, that of course Pakistan is suffering, and perhaps not because of its own fault. The second, there are two other observations that he made. One was, of course, about fighting hunger, and particularly about the Western countries, like not the Western countries, African countries. She said that the US is actually in possession of some genetically modified crops that are climate resistant. That is amazing idea, right? So perhaps the US can actually have partnerships with other countries. Pakistan, which has faced this, and we have no guarantee it is not going to be repeated in coming days or coming years. So such crops will be very useful as well. Then she also said that the US, regarding Pakistan, US doesn't only want to ensure that the people who have been affected by the floods are fed, but the fact also that they have the resilience, a system that is resilient enough that ensures their protection.
Right.
So I think what we keep on hearing from our local sources, for example, IMF or others, there doesn't seem to be any progress at all. But when you hear the sounds coming from the Western quarters, their policy leaders, something is actually being mulled over. I don't know how well Pakistan is pitching it. I hope that the best, since our best have gone there, I'm sure that they will be able to pitch for some kind of solution. But we do it, we do need it, and I think the West will commit to it.
All right, Mr. Michael, do you think that this realization is also being reflected in the kind of numbers that we are seeing in terms of aid support that is coming in? Of course, there was the original appeal that had been put forward by Pakistan and UN jointly, but then of course there is talk about how that figure perhaps does not really reflect the kind of loss and damage that we're seeing, or the scale of help that Pakistan would require. We have had pledges, but we haven't really been able to collect as much as the amount has been said, or how much Pakistan currently needs. And then when we talk about sustained support or support for resilient infrastructure, that's another chapter entirely. Do you think that the way that the international community has responded this time, of course there's the issue of donor fatigue, but in terms of the realization that this is a big climate change catastrophe and the world needs to start acting for their own selves as well, are the numbers reflecting that?
Well, unfortunately, no. The numbers have indeed fallen far short of what's needed, given the tremendous scale of what's going on. And if you just look at one specific aspect, assistance to help the children affected by the floods, the UNICEF has been saying that more than 3 million children, this is according to estimates just over the last few days, more than 3 million children need immediate care. And UNICEF had launched a campaign for assistance, and as of a few days ago, it had only been met by, only a third of it had been met. So that's just one aspect of this. That's aid to help children affected by the floods. So indeed, certainly the world has responded in a big way, in ways that go beyond messages of solidarity and support. The fact that you had the Secretary General spending several days in Pakistan touring the affected areas, that's pretty significant. And then sort of on a broader level, and the fact that, I don't want to, that Angelina Jolie came to Pakistan, someone with that type of impact, with that type of appeal and impact, particularly with younger people around the world. Clearly people are trying to build awareness and highlight just how serious the needs are in Pakistan. But yeah, I think we've seen, and I think I may have mentioned this on your show some days ago, that we're not seeing the type of response to these floods that we did to the 2010 floods, which were not as serious, and yet you had more countries responding more quickly in 2010 than now, and I think we already described the reasons for that. So this is the conundrum, that indeed, you have these powerful statements being made at the UNGA summit. You have multiple countries, including the US, bringing attention to the fact that more needs to be done to help Pakistan. But if you look at the assistance that's actually coming in, it's a drop in the bucket.
Michael, since we are talking about this delayed response or lukewarm numbers, let me ask you about our own experience, especially in 2005 when Pakistan was struck by an earthquake. At that time too, despite the fact that suffering was immediate, it took the world community months and months to provide the kind of relief that was needed. And I'm talking about in terms of money. Do you think that there is a possibility, and how much of this would you attribute to the bureaucratic red tapes and all those complications that might be contributing to the delay? Perhaps there is a possibility that the world community wants to help, but it will take some time.
Yeah, no, I'd like to hope, especially with all the attention being brought to the floods and the pretty significant levels of global media coverage, that we will see more assistance come later. But keep in mind that back in 2005, the earthquake you mentioned, and also 2010, it was much easier for the NATO countries to respond quickly because the NATO had a major presence in Afghanistan. So in terms of getting military logistical assistance to come in to Pakistan to assist with helicopters to evacuate people that are stranded, that was a lot easier to do in those cases because of the presence on the ground in Afghanistan next door. It's a very different story now. So that suggested it could be difficult. But I have to say that it was very striking that you had some days ago a large interagency senior delegation from the U.S. government in Pakistan on the ground to bring assistance and to talk about ways to bring more. And if the U.S., which is seen as one of the top powers in the world these days, if it's seen as doing that type of work, I would hope that would bring hope that other countries, especially in the West, would want to weigh in as well. And we've seen very quietly countries like Turkey and the UAE and a few others that have been very active, flying in supplies every day, using a humanitarian air corridor. That's all very encouraging. But it's hard to answer your question directly, Farouk, at this point. I think that to ensure that more assistance comes later, the important thing is that the attention continue, that the government in Pakistan needs to continue to focus on this and ideally prioritize that and not politics. And you also need to hope that the global media continues to focus on this issue as much as possible in the coming
point.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and that's indeed a very good point. Professor Salim, when we take a look at this particular issue, of course, we have, of course, on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly session, an entire week's exhibit regarding this climate carnage as well, and we're talking about this at every opportunity that we get, and it's important for us to be able to remember that. But what Michael is saying, of course, in terms of attention, it's our responsibility at home also to be able to focus on that and retain that in terms of our domestic population, but also in terms of international partners. Unfortunately, it seems that there needs to be reminders for even a catastrophe of this scale for everyone involved to be able to remember that there are people still suffering and need our help. What do you think can be done more in terms of making sure that this issue is not forgotten, that the climate change factors that affect countries like Pakistan are on the agenda items of discussion at every single platform, and that we are able to take this not just from a fact that this is a disaster relevant just to Pakistan, but the fact that its relevance exists everywhere?
Yes, I think one of the areas where we need to make more progress, and clearly this disaster showcases this, is that environmental concerns transcend political borders, and that we need to focus on regional approaches to environmental management. And of course, the most glaring aspect of this is the situation with with Pakistan-India relations, and whether or not India is engaged in terms of the larger hydrological management of these kinds of issues, as well as looking at the relief aspect. There's been very tepid communication on both sides, still saber rattling about other conflicts, rather than seeing that this is clearly an eco-regional moment. The rivers that flow into Pakistan have their headwaters in India. This is a transboundary issue. We keep talking about the Indus Waters Treaty, but the Indus Waters Treaty is not an environmental management treaty. It just divided the rivers between India and Pakistan by, the World Bank and an engineer from the Tennessee Valley Authority in the US. But it does not look at the full range of these issues from a climate change perspective. So I think that is what I find most disturbing. Even though there's a lot of progress at the UN, what we need more is regional cooperation on these matters. And we have even an organization the South Asian Commission on Environmental Protection, which predates even SARC, and that has not been utilized in such kinds of mechanisms. So I think that is an underappreciated opportunity, and I hope that India and Pakistan will use this as an opportunity for more environmental peace building approaches.
Absolutely. And Farooq, of course, there's regional help and issues that need to factor in our response as well. But there's obviously also what can be done on a national scale as well in terms of not just coordination in our efforts and our response, but in terms of also making sure that we're on the same page when we talk about issues such as climate disasters. Is that something that you see happening in Pakistan at the moment, or if there are any challenges or hindrances at home also that we can be more accountable of? Because, of course, we're quick to raise fingers and point at what needs to be done globally, but there surely will be much that we can do better at home.
Of course, while we actually depend on the world's generosity and kindness, we have to first ensure that our own house is in order. These people who are suffering are our people. The places that are underwater are part of Pakistani territory. So first of all, we have to keep the focus on it. Now, Pakistan, at this moment, we are lucky that we have a broad coalition of political parties ruling the country. That's why so many parties are united on this one point. But then, of course, when you talk about the state of affairs, particularly about one or two major opposition parties, they are not on the same page, they are agitating. And it seems that they only remember floods on the weekends when they go for their telethons, right? That said, let us also talk about the state of media. I don't think, with the exception of Hamid Mir, a few of our own anchors, including you, by the way, and a few others, I haven't seen much focus on floods, with the exception of the fact that anchors just talk about it randomly and then move on. My problem at this moment is that you need unity of command, unity of focus as well, and then unity of economic policy. That means that we keep on talking about how many PMs keep on changing in the country. That might be important, but at this moment, how important it is to keep the same finance minister, because we have changed an awful lot of finance ministers, and at this moment it seems also there seems to be some kind of infighting, or there might be some kind of push to replace the incumbent with somebody else. That changes the character of policy and direction. And unfortunately, because our media pundits actually base their analyses on the access they get. I saw on television today somebody who was very supportive of the current finance minister suddenly shifting gears and making an about turn. Yeah. So my humble submission is, whatever the politics you want to play, whatever politics you want to capitalize on, it can wait. Right now, it costs us in terms of human lives. Please have mercy on this country and let us focus on the floods and ensure that A, you get that relief or aid from the West, the world, and then you have enough transparency and operational capacity to ensure that it reaches the people who are suffering, and then you can structure your infrastructure that has been damaged as well.
Absolutely, that is indeed important. Michael, when we take a look at the kind of response that we're seeing, you mentioned what UNICEF is doing on ground, and the efforts, of course, are commendable. But it seems when we talk about the way that such response exists, not in terms of just international bodies, but bodies at home, individuals, organizations, and governments, it's seeming a lot chaotic and not coordinated, and in terms of prioritizing needs and being more efficient, that seems to be something that is lacking in the way that we're responding to this disaster. And I want to understand whether that's true for every disaster, and that when we look at the issues with regards to needs of different populations, such as children's needs, as you mentioned, and women needs, and now, of course, people who are sick, people who are elderly, there is so much that is simultaneously going on in terms of human suffering that it requires a more comprehensive and holistic response. Is that something that can be planned beforehand, such a catastrophe, or it can be incorporated in the way that we focus on our strategic measures to such responses and climate change action?
Well, I think it's important to observe that no government, no matter how powerful, no matter how strong, no matter how effective, would have been able to anticipate a a catastrophe as serious as this one, right? I mean, there was nothing that could have been done to prevent these rains, these monsoon rains, from coming so early and from being so intense for so long. No one, no government could have prevented that. So I think, in fairness to the Pakistani government and the Pakistani state, it's important to make that point, because there's been a lot of discussion about how historically Pakistan's emergency response capacities have been less than ideal, which is true.
Hmm.
But again, no government would have been able to respond perfectly to this catastrophe. No government would have been able to anticipate it. I do think that Pakistan is at a unique disadvantage now that it really has not faced in the past when it's had other terrible natural calamities. One is that you have, as I think was alluded to before by Farouk, such deep levels of political polarization, which I think has made it difficult for the country to come together as one, to speak, with a common voice, with a united voice to the international community, and also at home domestically. That's critical at a moment like now. So that's an issue. And of course, there's been this long-standing economic crisis, one of the most serious that Pakistan has had in some time. I think that has constrained Pakistan's ability to respond as well. And we know that Pakistan recently received a new IMF package, and the IMF has said that it wants to ensure that it can support the flood response as well. But when you hear that the preliminary estimates of the flood damage could be up to $30 billion, and this latest IMF package involved about just over $1 billion, it's a drop in the bucket. So it makes it very difficult for Pakistan. So that combination of this existing economic crisis, coupled with the political polarization, I think is going to make it very difficult for Pakistan in this case. And again, this is the type of catastrophe that even in the best of times would have been very difficult for Pakistan to respond to. But yes,
Right.
there are multifaceted issues here, and the children, women, particularly all the thousands of pregnant women that need immediate assistance, all of those impacted by waterborne disease. There's so many different immediate needs right now, and I think the question is how to come up with a clear, coherent strategy to figure out how to deal with so many urgent threats at the same time. It's very difficult. That's what makes international assistance so important.
Absolutely. Professor Salim, if we take a look at this response that is needed, of course, it seems that it has to be very comprehensive and holistic in nature, but that's not something that is restrictive to issues of climate change. That was also said by the UN Secretary General when he talked about how the world needs collective response in terms of other issues, such as conflicts or such as food security issues. And then when we look at the kind of political and economic interests that shape the way that relationships and dynamics that the international community have, it seems that perhaps the kind of global action or collective action that is being stressed upon may not be very present at the moment, or may not be possible in the near future. If we are indeed dealing with global issues and crises such as these, and then we look at the political and economic realities of the dynamics that exist, how do we move forward when we talk about all of these bodies, including the UN and other bodies that you've referred to, because they seem to be only playing a role at the stage of discussion. And when it comes to action, we are not guided by the norms or regulations of these bodies. We're in fact guided by something completely different, and we don't seem to be focusing on that.
Realpolitik.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But that is why I think that the UN has its role to play in terms of global environmental knowledge creation. You have organizations like the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and so on. But the UN is not very good at climate governance itself. It's good at knowledge creation. It's good at coordination and facilitation. A lot of the impact issues that need to be addressed will need to be done either through some of these implementing non-profit organizations, sometimes through armed specialized agencies of the UN, like the World Food Program and others, which deliver. But when it comes to sort of long-term structural response narratives, we need a regional approach. That's why I must impress upon Pakistan and its neighbors to start to get along better on environmental issues. There is just no other way about it. Whether you do it, if you think SARC is a moribund institution, think of other regional organizations. We just had the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's another new kind of an organization, relatively speaking, which has unfortunately taken on a certain political cadence, but it is at least regional. And so there could be an opportunity also to bring in more environmental factors through that. It's very important that environmental response is handled regionally. We see this, I have worked in many parts of the world, in Latin America. We have seen with hurricane response, it is done regionally. When you look at some of the other disaster aspects of, like, even ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, you see that a lot of that is done regionally. We need to have that reignited, and I hope that that's something all of the political parties in Pakistan can try to build consensus on. We can have disagreements on territorial matters, but we need to cooperate regionally on environmental issues.
Absolutely. Dr. Saab, I'm glad that you're talking about cooperation, and then you spoke about regional approach. I don't think any policy maker in Pakistan or political leader will disagree with you on the need to engage with India. But at this moment, there seems to be something very interesting going on. India has grown introvert of late. It was very clever of Pakistani leadership to personally go to the SCO as well and the UNGA. But at SCO, Narendra Modi arrived very late, and he hasn't gone to UNGA. The question is how actually to engage India and ensure that India is cooperating as well. I don't think that seems to be working right now.
Yeah, I think there are multiple ways of leverage on that, and this is where the US can play a constructive role. I know my friend Michael has also worked on a range of track 2 efforts and other ways in which these things can be undertaken, but I think that when it comes to issues like the environment, the US has the political capital to engage India, as well as some of the other regional countries, also bringing in Bangladesh and India into the mix, because Bangladesh also is very climate vulnerable and has also similar kinds of challenges with India. I think that is what we do need. If there is going to be some reset.
Dr. Salim, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have to go on a short break, but we'll be right back. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Cricket.
Welcome back to the debate. Unfortunately, we're short on time, so I'll take a quick comment from you, Michael. With regards to, of course, climate change issues, there is going to be all eyes on the COP27 next with regards to the kind of discussion that is going to happen, and, of course, the impact and change in discourse considering loss and damage financing. Will there be any realistic progress or improvement in terms of the way we move forward in terms of tangible action and funding for climate change issues? Are you hopeful?
Well, I wish I could be more optimistic, but if we look at how the world responded to another major borderless threat, that being the pandemic, we tended to see the world be driven apart more than brought together. So it's a difficult moment for sure in the current world order. But I really hope again that these floods and the scale of them will be a wake-up call to the world, and certainly to the region as well. As Salim noted, that it's time to get down to business and focus on working together regionally and globally to try to figure out how to bring some relief to countries like Pakistan that bear the brunt of global warming, even though they really have not contributed to it much at all.
Absolutely. Farooq, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would rather if you bring in doctors up first, and then I can just give you a one-liner.
Absolutely. Professor Salim, you can continue your thoughts as you were discussing earlier.
Yes, with reference to COP27, as someone who regularly attends the climate change meetings at the UN, we should not have very high hopes on this one. In fact, even the organizers don't have very high hopes because Glasgow was one of those decision moment COPs where the commitments were made. And now this is going to be very much procedural in nature in terms of the financing discussions in Egypt. However, I think what is an area of hope and development is the move towards adaptation and funding of adaptation, as noted. So that's something the UN is going to now pay much more attention to. The private sector is paying attention to it as well. We will definitely need that in the case of Pakistan, especially for cities like Karachi, which will need massive adaptive infrastructure development. Karachi is now considered one of the world's mega cities and by some measures the largest single local government jurisdiction in the world. So it clearly needs to have that adaptive infrastructure. People are not going to move out of Karachi. They need to have that adaptation.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yes, Farooq.
Can I now actually, first of all, before you actually thank Michael, I wanted to add to your complaint as well. Michael came to Islamabad, could not find time for our studio. So that I'm going to hold against you, Michael, until you actually come back and join us here in the studio. But regarding climate change, Sana, it is not a matter of hope. I think that at this moment, the Mother Nature is going to go to extremes. It has started with Pakistan. We might be the first, but we are not going to be the worst, I assure you that. It is going to behave like a terrorist organization which strikes one part and then another and then another, and it continues. So at this moment, no matter whether politicians actually want to deny climate change or they want to actually contribute to actual negativity, I assure you that in coming days, everyone will have to sit together and take this matter very seriously. For my country, I think that I'm glad that Pakistani leadership, our Prime Minister, our Foreign Minister, other senior ministers, climate minister, they went to SCO and they went to UNGA, and I hope they represent Pakistan at every forum because that shows our classical or traditional unity. That was important. Remember, there was a time when People's Party and PMLN could not sit together, but they are together and fighting for Pakistan. Secondly, Pakistan cannot afford to miss any major forum because right now it is not a fight for the leadership or the country or the elite. It is for the poor people who are suffering, and I think everyone has to justify to those people that they mean their betterment.
Absolutely. Thank you, Farooq. Thank you, Professor Salim Ali and Michael Kugelman for joining us and being a part of the debate. That's all that we have, and we really hope that the kind of things that we've talked about and the hope that we've expressed actually turns into reality and that there is ease in the suffering of the people, so many of them who are still suffering in Pakistan. That's all that we have from the debate.